Okay, thank you. Well, it's really a great pleasure and a privilege indeed for me to say a few words as an introduction to our next keynote speaker. Well, okay, it's meant to be open. Okay. Well, when I learned to know Samuel Pfeifer many years ago, we started, it was in the late 80s, the early 90s of the last century, we started to organize our Dutch field of religion and spirituality in mental health care. And Samuel Pfeifer had already become an opinion leader. So he was one of a few we invited to join us, to teach us, to inspire us. And he did. And since then we stayed in touch, and his support remained meaningful over the years. At that time, several of his books were translated in Dutch, and he reached out for a large Christian audience. Nowadays, he is retired, but still active and practices in his private practice. He was for many years the medical director of the Kliniek Zonnehalde in Rien, near Basel. He was professor at the Evangelische Hochschule in Marburg. He has his own website, and you can download his interesting materials, and there is quite a lot of it. And he even started, due to the pandemic, his own YouTube channel, and I recommend that to you. He is going to give us his view on religion and spirituality as relevant dimensions in psychiatric patients. He is really a wise man, a man of faith, and a very grateful man. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your introduction. And indeed, it was such a privilege to meet Peter over, well, almost four decades that we are going along and meeting at conferences. I think the most unusual and unexpected meeting was when I was with a group in Jerusalem, and we walked around the old city, and suddenly I saw a man standing there, and I said to my wife, "That is Peter Verhagen." But she said, "You know, you always think you see people." And I said, "No, that's him." And we went up to each other, and we just fell into each arms, and it was so nice to meet in the midst of Jerusalem without ever having expected it. So when you want to meet Peter Verhagen, just travel around the world. Somewhere you'll find him. Yeah, it was really nice. Now, the topics that you have given to me is religion and spirituality as relevant dimensions in psychiatric patients, from research to practice. And I have to say that I am speaking to you as a clinician, and not primarily as a statistical researcher. And that's already something very important. I had the privilege to travel the world and to be in the clinic where I was the medical director, and to relate to people. And to me, it was always very important to meet people in the situation in which they were, and to meet them with their very personal illness experience. a term that I borrowed from Arthur Kleinman, an anthropologist who distinguished between disease, which is one thing, but the illness experience is so much deeper, so much wider, and we have to empathize with people for whom we are caring. So this here is a visit in Bali, Indonesia, and there is a professor, Professor Suryani, the lady with the green shirt, and she brought me out about 2 hours drive into the jungle, into the villages, and she showed me the patients who are still shackled, some in chains. This man has also a special shackle for his legs. So this is where this man is sitting day and night after he he was not diagnosed with schizophrenia. He just was very disruptive, destructive, violent in his village. And that was the only way that the villagers were able to help him or to deal with it. Yeah. Professor Suryani, her project says we are bringing out medications to the villages. And with the help of those medications, she was able to liberate dozens of other patients who were locked in the villages, back in the pig yards or chicken yards, in chains. And I saw them there, you know, and it moved my heart to see how people still have to live in some areas of this world without medication, without professional mental health. And it's fascinating, and it's on the other hand heartbreaking, but there are possibilities with modern ways of clinical psychiatry. Now, when I talk about the difference between illness and disease, this man probably has schizophrenia, but this word, what does it say? But it's his experience that is shaping his life, and that's really parts. So when I talk about religion and its influence on psychiatric syndromes, then I first have a very clinical perspective. I have an anthropological, intercultural perspective. I have a qualitative, descriptive perspective. That's very important. You know, sometimes when we reduce disorders to statistics, that is a difficult thing. So clinical psychiatry has a deeply person-centered approach, which is not always matched by so-called objective research. And listening to individual stories and deeply personal perspectives of suffering, and to try to existentially empathize with psychiatric patients, cannot be pressed into the rigid molds of statistics. On the other hand, contemporary research is dominated by figure-based research, and in many fields by an emphasis of neurobiology over phenomenological descriptive publications. The contemporary clinician, therefore, must look at quantitative research and meta-analysis, trying to interpret them in the context of a person-centered psychiatry. And moreover, we have also to look at implications and the complex interactions of psychiatry, religion, and values. Thus, when I'm approaching the relationship between psychiatric syndromes and religion, spirituality, it needs a consideration of several aspects, which I have listed here in this list here. Yeah, you see it here again. Many studies, even if they try to measure as many factors as possible, end up with a scarcity of statistically robust conclusions, which is really frustrating, I must say. And Michael King, whose obituary we've seen just before the break or in this morning, in a broad study of more than 7,000 participants in the UK, quote, confirms that religious people are less likely to use alcohol and recreational drugs, but the study failed to confirm North American evidence that holding a religious understanding of life provides protection against mental disorders. It also concurs with other evidence from England that there is, and that's the important sentence, no clear relationship between religiosity and happiness. I think that's a finding that we all can confirm. Now, I have chosen three broad categories of diagnoses. I'll start with delusions. Oh no, there's one other preliminary aspect. I can already tell you which topics I will touch on. It will be delusions with religious content, it will be depression, and it will be anxiety disorders. But here we just have those three aspects which we have to look at. Are we talking about, when we see statistical correlations, are we talking about causality? Or is it just statistical correlations? And then there is another field where there is also research about coping resources in all three fields that I've already touched on. Now, let's see, and let's go to religious delusions. And actually, together with my colleague Sylvia Moore, she's a psychologist in Geneva. We wrote a chapter in one of the handbooks on delusions and hallucinations with religious content. And we prefer that over the term religious psychosis or religious delusions, but it's delusions and hallucinations as psychopathological substrate with the religious content. And we have to say, and I dare say, that delusional experiences are basically caused by neurobiological mechanisms. And when I'm looking back to the Bali experience, think that the simple provision of neuroleptics to those people who are chained has calmed them in a way that they could be freed. It's incredible. And when the clinic where I was a medical director goes back about 120 years. So when we had our 100-year jubilee, I looked back into the files of our patients of 1910 and 1920. And again, it was heartrending to see the fate of chronic schizophrenic patients at the beginning of the last century. I mean, these people really had to be kept in the institution for all the time, or for a very long time. And then suddenly there came the invention of the early neuroleptics. And the patient files described the changes in patients who got those neuroleptics, and they say suddenly they are able to smile. They are not smearing their excrements on their bodies. They are clothed normally. They can walk out and they are coming back. They become social beings again. To me, it was really moving to read those histories, what happened. And this is one of the major proofs that especially delusional disorders, schizophrenic disorders in its widest sense, do have a neurobiological mechanism. However, the content of delusions is marked by cultural factors, including religious concepts. There is empirical evidence that religion may have a significant supportive role in patients with schizophrenia too. We will get to that later. Now, there is one approach also to those delusions, that they can have perhaps some meaning for the patient, or at least a construction of meaning. But there are various studies, and we just looked at them. It was really interesting to look at the frequencies in different countries. You can't compare it. The methodology was so different that it was really difficult to make any quantitative conclusions. And there is a great overlap between religion and culture. So we need to have a development of a more stringent algorithm to even define delusions with religious content. And there is a very good article by Siddle, 2002, and he had this diagnostic algorithm that he says those people have a belief or attribution which is held with absolute certainty, can be bizarre, not amenable to rational arguments or doubt. But that is not yet enough. There have to be additional clinical symptoms of psychotic disorders. And then, okay, yes, in the content, there is religion, God, Satan, prophecy, spirits, angels, etc., etc. And very interesting and most important aspect to that algorithm is the ideas are not acceptable in the subculture or in the peer group of the patient. And that distinguishes it from a sectarian development, for example, or it distinguishes it from a very narrow fundamentalist, be it an evangelical group, be it a Hindu sect, be it a Muslim sect, be it a Jewish Orthodox subgroup. But even they say that is not what we think, what we believe, and we cannot explain, you need help. More or less, yeah. So it's not acceptable in the subculture. And then also, and that's another very important criterion, the lifestyle or goals suggest a psychotic episode rather than an enriching life experience. And perhaps you remember that we had the talk in the beginning by Christopher Cook on voice hearing. And many of those people who reported on hearing God's voice, for example, many of them had a positive experience, and to them it was a meaningful experience supporting their lifestyle. But in real psychiatric disorder, very often schizophrenia, can also be in manic episodes, in depression, etc., etc. The lifestyle and goals suggests a psychotic episode rather than an enriching life experience. So I think this diagnostic algorithm by Siddle is very helpful also to look at distinction between a causative aspect of religion in it. Now, and I have to select just a few interesting articles. Coming from the German-speaking world, I'd like to introduce you to a German study written by a friend of mine, Michael Pfeifer, and he made a comparison between psychiatric patients in Berlin, in the Charité, which is the most famous psychiatric clinic in Berlin, Eastern Berlin at that time. Actually, it was before the Iron Curtain fell. And he analyzed charts of delusional patients in the Charité, and then in a regional psychiatric clinic in Germany, in a very Catholic area in Regensburg. Religion was defined in general terms of transcendence, including supernatural belief in spirits and superstitions. And let's see some of the, here, we have that, yes. Here we have the results. Religious delusion occurred significantly less frequently in East Berlin than in Regensburg. 11 0.6% compared to 28.6%, which is quite significant. And the conclusion is the incidence of religious delusions in the context of schizophrenic disorders is essentially culture related. Religious delusions are to be classified as a secondary symptom of schizophrenia. Now, let's come to a Dutch study where Arjan Braam also was involved. And that was interesting, and I really do not want to withhold those findings from you. This group found that religious delusions are predicting a less favorable course over time in psychotic depression. That's the field of interest of Arjan and his team. And in schizophrenia, religious delusions persist more frequently compared to the most prevalent delusions. No significant difference was observed between patients with religious delusions compared to patients without religious delusions regarding indicators of clinical complexity. So, but again, what do we do with it? At least it is not sufficient to say religion makes you sick, so to speak. Yeah, there are some indicators, but we cannot really properly interpret them. For myself, I have made this simple drawing here that we have in our schizophrenic patients, we have the vulnerability that's there. We have psychosocial stressors that make life difficult for them. And we have a cultural environment of which religion is part, and it's a small part of the whole cultural environment. And that in it is then shaping the symptomatology of the schizophrenic episode. Plus, there is the word of coping. What is the relationship between religion and coping in schizophrenic disorders? There is also some empirical literature on that. And it was written, actually, when I first read this article, I was so surprised to read a group from Geneva, only about 150 kilometers from Basel, and I've never heard about them. Well, I soon contacted them and we got friends, but it was really interesting. They had a working group, and Pierre-Yves Brandt, he is a PhD, but in the theological department, and then some psychologists and psychiatrists, and Sylvia Moore is a psychologist, and they published, and as you know, the American Journal of Psychiatry is one of the highest citation journals, toward an integration of spirituality and religiousness into the psychosocial dimension of schizophrenia. Here are some of their methods and findings. They did semi-structured interviews about religious coping with a sample of 115 outpatients with psychotic illness. And they say 71% of the patients, for them, religion instilled hope, purpose, and meaning in their lives. And that was a Swiss sample in not all too religious city. Geneva is not much more religious than Amsterdam, from what I can observe. Nonetheless, 71% said religion did give them hope, purpose, and meaning. And 14% also said that they had spiritual struggles or spiritual despair. Patients also reported that religion lessened in 54% psychotic and general symptoms and increased them in 10% again, the aspect of spiritual struggles. It increased social integration. 28% versus 3% isolation. And there was a reduction of the risk of suicide attempts from 33% versus an increase of suicidality in 10%. So that was really a very important finding. The conclusion is religion is neither a strictly personal matter nor a strictly cultural one. Spirituality should be integrated into the psychosocial dimension of care. Our results suggest that the complexity of the relationship between religion and illness require a highly sensitive approach to each unique story. Again, Arthur Kleinman, the story of the patient, the illness narratives. But now let's move on to affective disorders and depression. Here is a very nice review article by Raphael Bonelli and Harold Koenig and David Rosemarin already in here, 2012. And they made an incredible effort when they worked on that article. Look at that. They screened 444 quantitative studies. And if ever you want to delve into more literature, you can go to that publication and just take in more of those significant studies. So I don't quote all the other studies, but here this is a very nice meta-analysis. And they found that 60% had less depression and faster remission from depression in those with more religion and spirituality. 6%. We also have to report the negative aspects had more depression, found more depression in religious patients. Now, some findings, they say religious beliefs and practices may help people to cope better with stressful life events, circumstances, give meaning and hope, and surround depressed persons with a supportive community. That's so important, the supportive community of Christian churches or religious groups. In some populations of individuals, however, religious beliefs may increase guilt. That was a finding also here in a Dutch study, and lead to discouragement as people fail to live up to the high standards of their religious tradition. Again, you can find that not only in the Christian or fundamentalist groups, but also, for example, in Muslim communities or in Jewish Orthodox communities. Then another intercultural study, again, I'm quoting Arjen Braam, and I'm not only quoting Arjen Braam because he is sitting in this room, but because he's really contributed to the field. And I commend you very much for that, Arjen. And here is a very interesting study here from Amsterdam, religious coping and depression in multicultural Amsterdam, a comparison between native Dutch citizens and Turkish, Moroccan, and Surinamese Antillean migrants. And again, published in a very highly respected journal, the Journal of Affective Disorders. Here, some findings, and you know, it's really a nice large group with 309 Dutch, 180 Moroccan descent, 202 Turkish descent, and Surinamese Antillean 85%. They did the RCOPE and the SCL90R, and again, they underline what we have found were correlations, but not causality. And again, that's an important message. Across all cultural backgrounds, there was a correlation between depressive symptoms with negative religious perception. I wonder if God has abandoned me, or punishment from God, anger at God, or questioning the existence of God. One of their conclusions is depression represents an existential void, irrespective of the religious background. Another article by Arjen Braam and Harold Koenig in 2019, another review, religion, spirituality, and depression in prospective studies. So looking forward, we have a religious person. How is this person developing over the years? Would that person be developing depression? How would the depression be influenced by their faith? And here we have, I mean, I was surprised to see 152 prospective studies that they found. And in 49%, significant association between religion, spirituality, and better cause of depression. A 41% non-significant, and 10% more depression or mixed results in religious patients. Again, the tendency more towards religious is supportive, and it's helping people to cope with depression. But there are also very non-significant studies, and that's what Michael King was referring to, that we didn't find those close correlations. And we also, even those who are friendly towards religion, we have to admit religion is not a panacea. It's not always solving problems, and it's not always preventing you from becoming depressed or having other disorders. It's not synonymous to happiness. More findings, they said, especially among persons identified with psychiatric symptoms, religion was more often protective. In younger samples and in samples of patients with medical illness, it was less often protective. Studies with more extensive adjustment for confounding variables showed significantly more often association with less depression, and geographical differences were not present. Now, here, I think I leave those away. These were formulated by Arjan in a chapter in a book, very, very nice also. So that the basic facts that can be found about religiosity and spirit and depression. Now, I want to show you one more very interesting study. It's the question of treatment response by Schettino and his group, published in 2011, and religiosity and treatment response to antidepressant medication. How interesting. Would more religious patients profit from medication, or would it even lower their religious emotional response? It's really interesting. They found a so-called U-shaped association between religion, spirituality, and depression. They did not find any correlation between the response and spirituality. And now here they are distinguishing between religiosity and spirituality. We have already discussed these two concepts. But in religiosity, they had this strong curvilinear relationship that people with low religiosity did not respond so well. And also people with high religiosity did not respond so well to antidepressants. And when we say antidepressants, it was always, I guess it was always combined with psychotherapy and helpful counseling, etc. But a moderate amount of religiosity appears to be independently associated with an enhanced treatment response to citalopram. What do you make of these figures? What I make is that, unfortunately, people with a high religiosity, and I did quite some studies also in the psychology of fundamentalism, is creating more spiritual struggles, thus more conflicts, and can be problematic to the recovery from depression. So this was a very interesting, actually really elegant study with elegant results also that are easy, that we can easily memorize. Now, one more aspect, and I have to tell you, it's a puzzling aspect to me, and I don't fully understand it, but at least I would like to report it to you. There are genetic correlates of spirituality and depression, and now that makes it really difficult. It's a study in offspring and grandchildren at high and low familial risk for depression. I mean, only to find all those patients and to examine their genetic codes is already highly complex. And I think we really don't understand completely what they really assessed. There are single nucleotide polymorphisms. I don't know who of you is a geneticist in here. Unfortunately, I am not. But it's really interesting what they found, and I think we'll stick to that, and you can read the original research later. The genetic markers are associated in persons with low risk for depression, with a high level of importance of spirituality and the religion. So that's really interesting. There is a sample where you can say from the genetic code, these people might have at least the tendency for a high level of importance of spirituality. Really interesting. Perhaps you have to check your DNA and see where you land in here. And then it depends how much risk you have for depression from your family background, which is another aspect. And in persons with a high risk for depression, no such significant correlations were found. Also very interesting. So again, it doesn't really answer our question, does religion make you sick when you have a depression? Or is there a genetic factor? Difficult, but at least it's aspects that researchers try to approach the issue. Now, let's come to the final or the third group. Anxiety disorders, neuroticism, and spiritual struggle. And here it's very important that we distinguish between clinical anxiety disorders and neurotic fears and conflicts, which also have sometimes a high level of anxiety, but in a different way, in a different clinical characteristic. Let's see. Here is a nice article, 2014, by a team in Hamburg, Dr. Agorastos. And they looked at the influence of religious aspects and personal beliefs on psychological behavior, focus on anxiety disorders. And here are some of their findings. Religion can be an important coping factor. So they start with the coping aspect. Overall, we did not find a robust correlation between clinical anxiety disorders and religion. And they confirmed another detailed review by Schrivenegger and Edelstein, 2004. Here it is from the Clinical Psychology Review. And they also did not find, they just confirmed that, but they did not find a correlation between religion and anxiety disorders. One more study here by Michael King. I already quoted it. Religion, Spirituality, and Mental Health, results from a national study of English households. And again, they did not find a correlation of anxiety disorders with religiosity, spirituality, or lack of spirituality, religiosity. So here you have some of the figures. And they just were not conclusive enough. However, he says a religious or spiritual life view confers no advantage in terms of mental health. That's where Michael King was quite open and also critical towards those who perhaps too positively attached a positive influence on religion on mental health. Conclusion of Agorastos, the Hamburg group, although RS and personal beliefs are complex and multidimensional parameters, relevant research has failed to incorporate broader, generally accepted concept of religious and spiritual constructs, leading to poor operationalization and thus incomparable data and contradictory results. So that is really, it's the confusion in itself in the methods where we try to make that into a statistical concept. Now, let's go to the other aspect of anxiety, which is covered by the term of neuroticism. And although ICD and DSM have abolished neurosis, I always ask, where has neurosis gone? And I have to tell you, it's alive and well. It's still there, but we have a hard time conceptualizing it in the ICD and DSM terms. But when we look at things in a psychodynamic way, then it's different. And there is also at least one measurement scale, well, more measurement scales, and that is neuroticism, which is one of the 5 scales in the neo-FFI. So this is really important. It is a very accepted scale in our time. Was constructed by Eysenck in 1952. And neuroticism describes a tendency toward increased stress, emotional instability, general emotional distress, dissatisfaction, and anxiety. Now, how is that influencing spiritual struggles? And now we find a correlation between religion and spiritual struggles and the anxiety aspect in a person. And this is a very nice article. You have here those very well-known authors, Julie Exlin, Kenneth Pargament, but Joshua Wilt is really also up and coming with his publications. And they examined the neuroticism in large samples, and they, on the one hand, they had an online sample, which was a broad sample across the population, and they had undergrad students. I mean, in America, you have millions of undergrad students to do research on, and they did measurements of religious conflicts, religious struggles, and the scales of the big 5 personality traits, including neuroticism. And it came out that religious struggles were primarily and significantly associated with the personality trait of neuroticism. Now, what does that say us? Does it tell us that it's the religious struggles that are causing neuroticism? And I have to tell you, even atheists have a proportion of the population with neuroticism. So no, it's the other way around. People with a more conflictuous personality, they also tend towards more religious struggles. So the correlation between neuroticism and religious conflict is 26 to 36%. Between religion and actual conflicts, much lower already. And between religion and long-term conflict, it's minus 7 to 16%, which shows, again, even religion has a protective function or a coping function. And we all who are working with patients with religious struggles and with a neurotic personality structure, we see very often that it's not always easy for them to deal with religion, with their upbringing, with their God image, with their guilt feelings, etc., etc. It's much harder for them than for a simple person who can, for example, I always like to read stories about people breaking out of a religious community. For example, the ultra-Orthodox in America. There are several very nice biographies of people, and if I may say so, healthier, less neurotic ones, they can say, I don't tolerate that context anymore. I'm going out, I'm building up my own life. And it's those who have more guilt feelings, more reservations about being illoyal, etc., who remain in the religious community and often really suffer from religious struggle or give in, and just adapt to their environment. So now a few limitations to what I presented to you. First, we are well aware that the defining diagnostic criteria, we're still at the beginning. Many researchers, even in a large meta-analysis, can't really be compared because the diagnostic criteria are not well defined. Then there are limitations of study cohorts. Then there are unknown factors, often very individual. There are genetic aspects, as we have seen, although, to be open, I don't really understand them. And then there is a variability of the religious factors, and they're also very often cultural. And the nice word, the sentence that we always say in the end, more research is needed. Yeah. So here's my summary. There are three C's, only three C's. We had already a list of 7 C's, I think. Culture is a very strong influential factor. Conflict is another factor, but also religion offers resources for coping, and thus religion still does have an influence on the syndromes that I've just described. And I hope that perhaps you can keep these 3 words as the factors that shape the influence on psychiatric syndromes. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for sharing from your expertise on this with us. Thank you. There are 5 minutes left, so there is time for questions. Are there questions in the chat? Not yet. So that gives you the opportunity to join in. It's not that late already. Again. Yes, please. One moment. I give you the mic.
Coming from the United States, I'm thinking of the various different groups there, cultural minorities. Is there a relationship, say, between emotional spirituality, emotional religious groups in terms of likelihood or less likelihood of any of these?
That's not an easy question. Sometimes how should I say? We know that charismatic people are more emotional than conservative evangelicals or conservative Orthodox Jews, for example. But does that make them more susceptible to psychiatric disorders? I'm not so sure, especially when there is a large, more charismatic group. Sometimes people who already have a vulnerability or have already experienced an illness episode are drawn towards the message of healing is available. And so they might flock towards more emotional forms of religion, promising them healing. So that might perhaps cause some statistical skewing, yeah. But I would be really careful to say charismatics are more prone to mental illness than other forms of religion. I'm reluctant to say that, yeah.
Yes, another question?
Actually, perhaps I can quote one interesting finding. There are some Amish groups around Philadelphia where there seems to be a genetic increase of manic depressive disorders, bipolar disorders. And because they intermarry rather closely within the communities, then there is a higher incidence of bipolar disorder in Amish communities, some communities, yeah.
Okay, yeah, Professor Glas?
I've been, I'm not an expert in this field, but I've been thinking for a while that maybe the study of relationships between DSM disorders and religion are comparing apples with pears or whatever. And maybe it might be more fruitful to focus on mediating and moderating factors in the origination or in the causation of psychopathology, or on transdiagnostic factors. So I'm curious to know what you think about this. So what do you think of an approach in which the relationship between religious and spiritual factors and these transdiagnostic and mediating factors is taken as central point of entrance to the discussion?
Well, that is not making our task easier, that proposal. It even makes it more complicated, because if you look at mediating factors, they are almost as individual as all the histories that we, especially in delusions and hallucinations with religious content. What experience should we take as a mediating factor? They are very difficult to categorize. So I've not yet found even good categorizations of intermediate factors. We do know in say in very narrow religious groups, which are I only find the word sectarian, but there is another very nice word on very constrictive in their scope, that could cause more conflicts. But again, especially in the spiritual struggle domain, perhaps also depression, guilt feelings, that can sometimes be an intermediate factor. But there are so many other factors that these intermediate factors alone are not accounting for substantial or for enough high statistical correlations. Yeah.
Yeah, there's one question from in the chat.
Professor Baumann, perhaps you can turn up and raise your question directly if you use the microphone.
I don't hear you.
I am on the train. Maybe the connection is not as good.
Okay.
So maybe you read the question. It's easy.
Your train is better than here in the hall. It's a great train. It's a German train, I think. Yes.
Okay. So Samuel, thank you very much for your great presentation, which I like very much, and also all the papers that you presented. You also hinted to consequences for the practice in psychiatry and psychotherapy. Could you add some more implications?
Can we ask some more recommendations?
Recommendations
for psychotherapy and psychiatry.
Recommendations for psychotherapy and psychiatry. You want to listen another hour? No. But I think one is that when we encounter people with psychopathology that is also shaped by religious aspects, that we not just say, oh, because he's so religious, that's why he is so sick. That would be very wrong. So we rather should respectfully approach these people, see that this is their culture, might be their culture in delusion. Sometimes they even develop religious ideas in the process of the development of the delusional syndrome. But approach them with respect and not fixate them on religion alone, but to look at their whole context of life, also their coping resources. And when there is a neurobiological disorder like schizophrenia, and also severe depression, which has neurobiological aspects, then to treat them in an adaptive way along the guidelines of psychiatry, and to see how things develop and then look at their questions of meaning and coping with the situation. So not narrow down the diagnostics or the evaluation on the religious aspect. That to me is really important. Yeah.
One last question, a rather personal question. As you know, over the years, there have been a lot of criticism on persons like you know, because all these guys like the Pfeifers and others who talk in a positive way about religion and psychiatry, in the end, they just want one thing to achieve, and that is to evangelize again. What would be your comment on that?
Again, here I have my own story. It's too long to tell everything to you, but I'm coming from a rather conservative Christian background, but my father was thrown out of his community because he married a woman who was not from the same religious community, brethren, I may say, so he was thrown out. And there was one Bible verse that he gave to us children: "Do not anyone let to limit your freedom." So he encouraged us for freedom. I must admit that on my road to freedom, I also had to start to accept that there are various denominations, there are various religions. I have lived for a year in Israel and there among Muslim patients, and I was very impressed by their spirituality. I have been traveling around the world and been in many cultures. And I must admit that I have found so many good thoughts and wisdom also in other cultures, other religious contexts, that I'm very reluctant to evangelize, but to support people in their search for a positive meaning, and perhaps at least for an awe for the great God who is above us all. But how this God reveals himself to the person, I have to leave open at least to the individual with whom I am talking in the psychotherapy hour. But on the other hand, I have to keep my roots, which help me to cope with my very personal life. And I think that is a tension in which we constantly are living. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.